Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the fiercest ideological showdowns of the 20th century, fascism versus communism. These aren't just political buzzwords tossed around in heated debates. Oh no, these are the blueprints that shaped entire regimes, mobilized millions, and left trails of war, revolution, and repression in their wake. Fascism and communism were two of the most influential and deadly political ideologies of the last century. They didn't just reshape nations, they redefined what it meant to govern, to control, and to sacrifice. Both systems were responsible for immense human suffering. We're talking about global wars, purges, gulags, concentration camps, and a terrifying level of state control over daily life. And they didn't operate in isolation. These ideologies were at the very heart of the biggest global conflicts of the century. World War II? That was fueled in large part by fascist regimes like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. The Cold War? That long, icy stare down between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was communism versus capitalism, with nuclear weapons just waiting to be launched. But this presentation isn't just a history lesson. It's a journey through the roots, the principles, the beliefs, and the legacies of these two powerhouse ideologies. We'll unpack their similarities, their dramatic differences, and how they each left deep scars on the modern world. So get comfortable, or don't, because some of this content is going to be deeply uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Let's begin our exploration of one of the most dangerous battles of ideas the world has ever seen. To understand how fascism and communism came to dominate entire regions of the world, we need to go back to their roots, their origin stories, if you will. These ideologies didn't just appear out of thin air. They were born out of chaos, fear, and the deep dissatisfaction people felt with the systems around them. Let's start with fascism. Fascism is what we call a reactionary ideology. That means it didn't arise to build something new, but rather as a response to something people wanted to tear down. In early 20th century Europe, many saw liberalism and socialism as weak, chaotic, or even dangerous. Fascism offered a return to tradition, to national pride, and to order, by any means necessary. It first took root in Italy after World War I. The country was reeling from a shattered economy, political instability, and a general feeling that Italy had been shortchanged in the war's aftermath. Enter Benito Mussolini. In 1922, he marched into power by promising to restore greatness, unite the nation, and crush opposition. And with that, the world's first fascist regime was born. Fascism glorified the state above all. It was obsessed with nationalism, hostile to communism, and eager to use militarism to enforce unity. Dissent wasn't just discouraged, it was destroyed. You didn't get to disagree with the fascist state and walk away untouched. Now swing over to the other side of the spectrum and you've got communism, a revolutionary ideology. While fascism looked backward to restore a glorified past, communism looked forward to a radically different future. Its roots stretch back to the 19th century, with thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Their Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, was a fire starter. It argued that history was the story of class struggle, and that the only solution was to completely overthrow capitalist systems. Communism aimed to create a classless, stateless society. No private property, no economic inequality, no exploitation. The idea was that the workers of the world, the proletariat, would rise up, seize the means of production, and establish a system where everyone shared everything equally. Now, in theory, that might sound appealing to those who had been crushed under the weight of industrial capitalism. But as we'll see, the way these ideas played out in reality was anything but utopian. So there you have it, two ideologies born from chaos. One promising order through authority, the other promising equality through revolution. Both would go on to change the world in ways few could have imagined. Alright, now that we know where these beasts came from, let's get into what they actually believed. Because on the surface, fascism and communism look like total opposites. And in many ways, they are. But if you look a little closer, there are some eerie echoes between the two. Let's start with fascism. At its core, fascism is all about authoritarian nationalism. That means the nation is placed above everything, your rights, your freedoms, even your life. The state becomes a sacred entity, often embodied in a single charismatic leader. This leader is seen as the voice of the people, the guardian of the nation, and the only one who can bring order. Questioning the leader? That's not just criticism, that's betrayal. Fascism also believes in the supremacy of the state over the individual. You don't exist to pursue happiness, you exist to serve the nation. Your value is measured by how useful you are to the state's goals. It's the political version of, don't think, just do. Another major feature is the preservation of traditional hierarchies. Fascism loves a good power structure, whether it's based on class, gender, or race. It resists anything that smells like equality. Instead, it reinforces the idea that some people are naturally superior, and society should reflect that with strict roles and ranks. Now let's slide over to communism. In many ways, it flips the fascist script. Communism dreams of a classless, stateless society where everyone is equal, and nobody owns anything privately. In theory, the state eventually dissolves because there's no need for authority when everyone is sharing equally. Sounds ideal, right? In theory, one of communism's most central beliefs is the abolition of private property. Property, in this view, is the root of inequality. It separates the haves from the have-nots and allows a few to exploit the labor of the many. So the solution? Eliminate private ownership and put everything into the hands of the community, or more often, the state. That leads us to collective ownership of production. In capitalism, factories, farms, and businesses are privately owned. In communism, they're owned collectively. Everyone shares in the output. At least, that's the idea. In practice, the state often ends up running everything, which leads to a whole new set of problems. So, while fascism demands loyalty to a powerful nation-state and resists change, communism promises a future without inequality by tearing down the existing system. One looks to the past for strength, the other looks to the future for salvation. But both, as we'll see, had a way of tightening their grip on people's lives in the name of ideology. Every ideology needs its architects, the people who take the theories, add a little charisma, and turn them into living, breathing regimes. These are the faces behind the movements, the names etched into the walls of history, some infamous, some mythologized, all powerful. Let's start with fascism's poster child, Benito Mussolini of Italy. Mussolini was the original fascist, the one who took the ideas off the drawing board and planted them in government. He ruled from 1922 to 1943 and promised to revive the glory of ancient Rome. His regime was all about ultranationalism, strict authoritarian control, and the suppression of opposition. He marched on Rome, seized power, and turned Italy into a one-party state. Think of him as the prototype for fascist dictatorship. Next comes Adolf Hitler in Germany. From 1933 to 1945, Hitler led Nazi Germany with terrifying precision. He combined Mussolini's authoritarianism with a twisted racial ideology, launching a global war, perpetrating the Holocaust, and leaving behind devastation on a scale the world had never seen. His name is now practically synonymous with fascism, and for good reason. He showed just how deadly this ideology could become when taken to the extreme. Then there's Francisco Franco of Spain. After the Spanish Civil War, Franco came to power in 1939 and held it until 1975. His regime was militaristic, authoritarian, and staunchly anti-communist. While not as globally aggressive as Hitler, Franco's dictatorship was marked by repression, censorship, and control over nearly every aspect of Spanish life. Now let's switch gears to the communist side. We begin with Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Lenin led the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, overthrowing the Russian monarchy and laying the groundwork for a communist state. But it was Stalin who truly transformed the USSR. Through brutal industrialization, mass purges, and total control over society, Stalin molded Soviet communism into a global powerhouse and a regime defined by fear. Then we have Mao Zedong in China. Mao led the Communist Revolution and established the People's Republic of China in 1949. His policies, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, caused widespread famine, purges, and chaos. Mao was a master of revolutionary fervor and mass mobilization, often at staggering human cost. Finally, Fidel Castro in Cuba. In 1959, Castro led the Cuban Revolution and turned the island into a one-party communist state aligned with the Soviet Union. While Cuba's scale was smaller, its symbolic role in the Cold War, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was enormous. These leaders didn't just rule, they embodied their ideologies. They turned abstract theories into powerful regimes, using propaganda, violence, and charisma to solidify their hold on power. And as we'll see, they left deep, lasting marks on their nations and the world. Alright, now let's talk about how these regimes actually worked, not just what they believed, but how they stayed in power. Because if there's one thing fascist and communist governments had in common, it's this: they didn't leave things to chance. They controlled, monitored, manipulated, and eliminated anything that got in their way. Let's start with propaganda. In both systems, propaganda wasn't just a side project, it was a lifeline. Governments flooded the public with carefully crafted messages designed to shape how people thought, felt, and behaved. Newspapers, posters, radio broadcasts, films, every channel was used to glorify the state, praise the leader, and demonize the enemy. Truth was whatever the regime said it was. Now enter censorship. Anything that didn't fit the official narrative was silenced. Books were banned, newspapers shut down, films edited or destroyed. If you were caught expressing the wrong opinion, or even asking the wrong question, you were in trouble. Free speech wasn't just limited, it was non-existent. Then there's secret policing. Oh, these regimes were masters of surveillance. In fascist Italy, you had the WWII. In Nazi Germany, it was the Gestapo. In the Soviet Union, the NKVD, later the KGB. These weren't your average law enforcement officers. They operated in the shadows, listening, watching, arresting anyone suspected of disloyalty. And they didn't just go after criminals. They went after thoughts. Thought crime, long before Orwell made it famous. Political opponents, gone, often literally. Dissidents were arrested, exiled, imprisoned, or executed. Entire families could disappear overnight. The goal was to eliminate not just resistance, but the possibility of resistance. Now here's where it gets particularly chilling: indoctrination. Both fascist and communist regimes didn't just control people's actions, they aimed to shape their minds from childhood. Education systems were restructured to teach loyalty to the state. Kids learned the leader's biography before they learned math. Youth organizations trained them to be obedient, patriotic, and ready to report on their own parents if needed. And then there's the good old-fashioned use of violence. Public executions, purges, mass arrests, forced labor camps. These weren't just punishments, they were warnings. The regimes made examples out of people to remind everyone else obedience is survival. So while the ideologies of fascism and communism might seem like opposites, their methods of control often look disturbingly similar. It wasn't enough to rule, they had to dominate every aspect of life, public, private, and even personal. Now that we've seen how these ideologies worked on the inside, let's zoom out and look at what happened when they collided with the rest of the world. Because when fascism and communism weren't busy controlling their own people, they were reshaping global history through conflict, and often, through catastrophic violence. Let's start with fascism's most infamous explosion, World War II. Nazi Germany, under Hitler, wasn't just about running Germany. It was about expanding, conquering, and enforcing a brutal racial hierarchy across Europe. Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich led directly to the invasion of Poland, which triggered the war. From there, the fascist machine swept across the continent, France, the Low Countries, North Africa, and allied itself with fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. The result? Tens of millions dead, cities in ruins, and the Holocaust, which murdered 6 million Jews alongside millions of other victims deemed undesirable by the regime. Fascism's aggressive nationalism wasn't just a policy, it was a powder keg, and once it blew, it pulled nearly every major power on Earth into a devastating global conflict. Now let's look at communism. Its big boom moment came not in one global war, but in a different kind of battle, the Cold War. After World War II ended, the Soviet Union emerged as a communist superpower, and the world split into two camps, the capitalist West and the communist East. This wasn't a direct war between the United States and the USSR, but rather a series of proxy wars, arms races, and ideological standoffs that lasted nearly half a century. Think of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, all fueled by the belief that communism and capitalism couldn't coexist. Countries were pressured, bribed, or bullied into choosing a side. Entire regions became battlegrounds for ideological supremacy. And here's the thing, both fascism and communism inspired imitators and adaptations around the world. Franco's Spain, Pinochet's Chile, Pol Pot's Cambodia, North Korea, the Eastern Bloc, each with its own twist, but often echoing the same brutal tactics and rigid control. These ideologies weren't just domestic policies, they were global forces. They drove invasions, shaped alliances, triggered wars, and redrew borders. They demanded loyalty not just from citizens, but from nations. So when we say these ideas went boom, we're not exaggerating. They exploded across the globe, through bullets, bombs, and bitter rivalries, leaving legacies we're still trying to reckon with today. So, after all the wars, all the bloodshed, and all the iron-fisted regimes, you might be wondering, are these ideologies finally dead? Well, not quite. Fascism and communism may have lost their 20th century superpower glow, but their shadows are still with us. Like stubborn ghosts, they keep reappearing in different forms, in different places, often wearing different names. Let's start with fascism. While full-blown fascist regimes are rare today, the ideas haven't disappeared. We still see movements around the world that promote extreme nationalism, glorify strongman leaders, and scapegoat minorities. These movements often thrive during times of economic crisis or political instability, just like their predecessors. They may not call themselves fascist, but the rhetoric is familiar. Law and order above all. Us versus them. The nation must be purified. Sound familiar? And what about communism? Officially, yes, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and that was a major turning point. But communism didn't vanish. Countries like China, Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, and North Korea still operate under one-party systems rooted in communist ideology, though some, like China, have mixed in heavy doses of capitalism along the way. Even outside those nations, the ideas haven't gone away. Debates about wealth inequality, state control, and worker rights continue to echo Marxist thought. In some corners of the political world, communism is still held up as the ideal antidote to capitalism's flaws, and both ideologies, despite their tragic histories, continue to attract followers, especially online. Some people romanticize the past, others never learned the full extent of the atrocities committed in the name of these beliefs, and some are simply desperate for an alternative to the status quo, just like those who first embraced these ideologies 100 years ago. So no, they're not dead. They're dormant. They've changed forms. They've slipped into new languages and platforms. But the core ideas, the hunger for utopia, the desire for control, the belief in total transformation, those are very much alive. And that's why we study them, not just to understand the past, but to spot the signs when history starts to rhyme again. As we wrap up this journey through the clash of fascism and communism, let's take a moment to reflect on what it all means, beyond the headlines, beyond the history books, and beyond the battlefield. These two ideologies weren't just political blueprints, they were worldviews, radical visions of how society should function, who should lead, and what individuals were worth. They promised salvation, they delivered control, they claimed to speak for the people, but in practice, they often silenced them. Fascism taught us how dangerous unchecked nationalism can be. When a state defines itself through purity, strength, and obedience, it leaves no room for dissent or diversity. And when the leader becomes the law, the door is wide open for abuse, war, and genocide. Communism, meanwhile, showed us the risks of utopian thinking, of believing that if we just hand everything over to the state, paradise will follow. In the pursuit of equality, it too crushed freedoms, imprisoned millions, and enforced ideology through fear. The dream of a classless society was betrayed by the very systems created to achieve it. But perhaps the biggest lesson from the 20th century's dark duel is this: extremism, of any kind, has consequences. When compromise dies, when voices are silenced, when one idea becomes absolute, freedom disappears. And history has a habit of reminding us, again and again, just how fragile our freedoms really are. So if this video left you thinking, questioning, or even just curious to learn more, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts or questions. I read them all. And if you enjoyed this breakdown of history's ideological heavyweights, check out some of my other videos here on Truth Behind History. We explore the untold stories, the messy truths, and the real forces that shape the world we live in. Thanks for watching, and remember, the past isn't dead. It's not even past.